Hey, so a bit of a weird start to the talk, right? So the topic I was given is to speak on the innkeeper. And all week I've had people from our church and in my job, because I'm all over the country for my work now, going, wait, what? There is no innkeeper. And I was like, yeah, so it's kind of tricky. So we were talking about young adults like a week ago, and they decided it's really a bellhop would be better. So I've got bellhop pictures up there. But if you know the Bible, and if you heard what Ross was reading, there really is no innkeeper, right? It just says there's no room, and then depending on the translation, it might say the inn, it might say there's no lodging available. The Greek word for inn, in Luke, it just means a place where people resided. And so back in the day, a lot of people lived in caves. So it could have been a cave, could have been a family house that they were turned away from. There were guest houses, not a lot, but there were guest houses around, so it could have been a guest house. So it's kind of weird trying to preach on someone who doesn't even exist. And one of my friends who I work with is like, so if you preach on the innkeeper, you're basically lying the whole sermon. And we agreed that's probably not a good idea, right? So I did this really cool thing called praying and kind of went down a whole nother track. So I'm not really talking about the innkeeper at all. So if that upsets you, you can email me and I'll just delete your email without reading it. So that's all good. But I wanted to start by just thinking about the logic. Where was, what might have the place been that they lived in? So this made me think about some of the worst places I've ever stayed. So hands up if you've stayed in a place where when you were staying there, you were like, this is terrible. Hands up, anyone? Yeah, a heap. We've all done it, right? So the two worst ones I can remember, I'm sure there's been others, the two worst ones I can remember were, one, Joseph and I, when we used to live in Chicago, we went and visited some friends up in Michigan and stayed with them for a couple of nights, and then we needed to get back to the train to get back into Chicago, and for some reason we were really late. And I still remember driving around these back roads of Michigan in this really old, falling apart car at terrifying speeds trying to get us to the train station. And that classic thing where as we pulled into the train station, the train was pulling out, and it was like, no train. And so what are we going to do? We had to be back at university for work in the morning, and so our friend was like, hey, there's a motel here right beside the train station. You could stay there. And we stayed there. I've stayed in some nasty motels. It was disgusting. Like, it was one of those ones where you walked in and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad there's no blue light. You know, they have that blue light, and you're like... And like, we just didn't want to touch anything. And I remember we lay in the bed and we were like, we're just not going to move. We're not going to move all night. And it was so disgusting, Jose. It was so hideous. The other one, the weirdest place I've stayed, this is just a real weird one. So my parents used to live in England, and so we visited them and did like a couple of weeks in France and stuff. And when we were in France, we were staying in these really cheap hotels. We're not super rich like all of you. Oh, and sorry, kia ora, podcast people, kia ora, video people, how you doing? Good to see you. And so we stayed in this real weird motel, hotel, whatever, in France. And what they'd done, they'd literally built like pods, right? And so you could imagine they'd just got a crane and had just podded in all these little rooms that looked like they'd just gone click, 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 all these rooms. And then same with the bathroom. So the toilet and the shower was separate, and it felt like they'd just gone click, 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 and put them wherever. But when you went into the toilet or into the shower, it was super weird. It was like one perfectly molded room. So you go in the toilet. I know we shouldn't talk about toilets at church, but last time I checked, we all go to the bathroom. You went into the toilet, and the entire room was just one molded plastic. So the wall, it was just molded plastic down, up to the seat. There's no seat thing, just one molded plastic weird thing. And so it was real, but wait, it gets fantastic. So you'd have a shower or a toilet. Let's do the shower, because toilet's gross. We won't talk about that. So you'd have a shower, and when you went out and shut the door, boiling hot water and chlorine just went and just flooded the whole place to clean it. Same thing in the toilet, right? And I kept thinking, what happens if you go to walk out of the shower, you've opened the door and you think, oh, I need my soap, and you shut the door to get your soap, boiling water, I don't know. You'd be really boiled. So anyway, so what's the place where Mary and Joseph kind of end up staying? And there's a whole bunch of craziness I'm going to talk about in a second, but we really have absolutely no idea. Like I said, the Greek word is very vaporous. It just means a place of lodging, right? Most people believe it could have been a cave. So a lot of people lived in caves back then, right? Which is like, makes sense. It's dry and it's all good. It could have been some kind of barn. It could have been a guest house. We don't really know where they end up. They're just turned away from here. What's most likely, and I'm sure most of you know this, what's most likely is that in their day, because animals were super valuable and it gets really cold in Israel, they would have the animals sleep inside. And so imagine a really small house. It's like tiny, like it's really like a big shed. And probably half, three-quarters of it is like maybe hay and dirt and whatever, and that's where the animals would be, and you'd bring them in at night to protect them, keep them close to you. Plus the animals would give warmth because they'd warm up the room, right? And then on a slightly elevated platform, like only a couple of feet, what's that, like 60 centimetres? I don't know, that new modern fandangled metrics. So like really low would be where the family would live. And it was really, really small, and it would just be a bed, often they'd all sleep together, and a little place to cook and stuff. And so that's possibly where they are. So super, super basic, right? But when you read the verses, there's a couple of things that are just real crazy. So if you've got your Bible, go back to Luke. I just want to read it. And it's always weird preaching on Christmas because we've all read the story like 1,000 times, right? It's just this little bit right at the end. Where'd it go? I'll just read verse 7. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn, right? So here's a couple of little questions I had when I was going through this, or kind of key bits that jumped out at me about the story. So first of all, it's this one here. Mary and Joseph are still only engaged at this point. So this is where it's like there's something very weird going on in this whole story that we miss as Westerners. So the first thing is, in Jewish culture, and I know a lot of you know this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. In Jewish culture, the engagement went for a year, right? And so they'd be engaged for a whole year, but they would never, ever be alone. They would always only be together when they were with family, right? So the thought of Mary and Joseph being alone with no people was like, a Jewish person would have just gone, you can't, you just don't, you just would never do that, right? But when we read the story, they're alone, and they're still not married. And in Jewish culture, this is just the most evil thing you could ever do. This is completely crazy. So one of the big theories in what's going on is that they've just been really, really ostracized from their family, which makes sense, right? So you've got to imagine Mary's 13 or 14. They know she's engaged to Joseph, and then she comes out one morning and says to her parents, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what happened last night. An angel came to me. Now, you guys know, 400 years, right, since God's spoken. I mean, he spoke to Zechariah just before this, but they would never have heard about that encounter with Zechariah. So as far as Mary's parents, and therefore extended family, because they would have been local, have heard, God doesn't speak, 400 years. And now this 13, 14-year-old girl comes out going, an angel, God spoke to me. It would be like, what a lie. Makes sense, right? You with me? But she keeps holding on to that, keeps holding on to that. And then you start seeing the old belly growing, and you're like, okay, what's going on here? And then next minute now, Joseph buys into it as well. Because remember then later on, a couple of months later, Joseph has a visit from the angel, and now he comes to Mary and says, yep, oh my gosh, you're telling the truth. He would have told her parents, and again, it's like, this is just absolute lies. So now it's really obvious that Joseph and Mary have done what you never do in Jewish culture. They have had sex before marriage, which is just like, oh my gosh, they should be stoned according to Old Testament law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But they keep holding on to this story until it's time to head off where Jesus is going to be born. And so what most people think is that they travel alone, which you just never did. You always traveled in groups, right? Remember when Jesus goes to the temple when he's 12 and Mary and Joseph lose him for like 3 days? It's like, how did they lose him for 3 days? It's because they were traveling in a massive family group. This is what you always did. So the idea that Mary and Joseph traveling alone and then there's no room. It's like, what? Jewish culture, there's no room. What is happening? It's like, obviously everyone who sees them is like, they've been doing the wild thing outside marriage. This is serious. You with me, eh? Yeah, right? Just shocking. The other bit that always makes me cry is verse 7. Jesus is wrapped in cloths by Mary. Again, this never, ever happened in Jewish culture. So remember the story of Moses being born? When Moses is being born and Pharaoh's wanting to just wipe out all these kids, and so he says to the midwives, whenever a boy is born, chuck it in the river. And then the midwives lie, which is really interesting. It's one of the first times you see, I will obey God rather than government. Makes sense, right? So they lie, and they're like, no, the Jewish women are so strong, they have babies before we get there, which is like a total lie, right? So they don't have to throw them away. So we know there's like literally a job of midwives going back 4,000 plus years, right? The idea of a Jewish woman having a baby by herself without a midwife, never heard of. without family, never, ever heard of. And so you read this verse, right? Jesus is wrapped in cloths by Mary, and I cry often when I think of this, and I'm like, this is my understanding, and most people agree with this. There's some people that don't quite go as far as this, but I always go, oh my gosh, when Mary is standing, kneeling, whatever she's doing before that angel, and the angel tells her what's going to happen, and she goes, I am the Lord's servant, may it be to me as you have said. She knows what's coming, right? You with me, eh? She knows what's coming, but yet she still obeys, and she still goes, okay. And then for the next 9 months, this whole, I'm going to say it, man, everyone would have been talking behind her back and saying, I won't say the word I'm thinking of, bad words about her, right? May it be to me as you have said. You know, it's like, I am the Lord's servant. Amazing. And then the bit that makes me cry is like, family would be everything in Jewish culture. It's everything. And to imagine poor little Mary, no idea what she's doing, because this is normally done by a midwife or a mum, an auntie at least, all this. She's given birth to this kid, maybe on the crappy, it's just, what is going on? Joseph would have been about as much help as a fish at a bar mitzvah, right? He'd be like useless. He'd have no idea what's going on. It just makes me cry, and then I just imagine Mary taking the baby. It's what you always did in their culture. You wrap it in swaddling cloths, wrap it up all tight. Normally the mum never did this first one. It was always like this, a family member or the midwife would do it. It's sad, eh? You with me, eh? It's just really sad, really sad. So what I wanted to think about is this simple question. I put this in the newsletter this week, right? Why did Jesus have such a tough life? Like, what is God saying to us? What is God wanting to do through Jesus having just such a hard life? Like, what a crazy beginning, right? Now, think theologically with me for a minute. None of the hardness of Jesus' life is needed for him to save us, right? You with me, eh? He could have been born in a palace, literally. That's not going to change anything, right? Might make it a bit harder for the old shepherds to get in, but it doesn't change our salvation, right? So when the wise people visit Jesus maybe a year or two later, he's in a house, right? We know that. You with me, eh? Yeah, he's in a house. And it sounds like it's a pretty normal kind of house, the word that they use there. And so it's like, well, why wasn't Jesus just born in a nice house and not put in a manger? What's with the manger thing? What is God trying to say to us, right? Why is there no midwife? Why is there no family? Why does poor little Mary have to do the wrapping? What's God saying? Because it has nothing to do with salvation, right? You with me, eh? Okay, thanks for I love the enthusiasm. This is my favourite church to preach in by miles. I love you guys. Okay, so what I did is I kind of went down this whole track of thinking about the hardness of Jesus' life, and my big question is why? What was God doing? What's God saying? What's God communicating to us in the hardness of Jesus' life? So I listed out a whole bunch of stuff, and when you start listing out all the horrible things that happened to Jesus, it's massive, so I cut it down to just a couple of slides. So here's the first one. I'll read these and then I'll talk through them. His family must flee to Egypt to save his life, tempted by Satan for 40 days. His people reject him, face persecution and threats, betrayed by Judas, unjustly arrested and tried, emotional and spiritual agony in the garden. You just choose one or two of those and you're like, wow, that's a rough life. But when you look at all, and there's another whole slide coming, right? When you look at them, it's like, oh my gosh. I mean, not to be too crazy, how many of us have literally had to flee our country for our lives? Not many. I know, where's Ailey? I mean, heaps of those poor Converse people, that's literally their story. I remember talking to heaps of them a few years back and just being absolutely broken at the stuff they went to because they were fleeing their country. It's the next level, right? Jesus is he's an immigrant, man, tempted by Satan. 40 days without food, possibly drinking water, most probably, or he'd be dead. By the end of the 40 days, he would be skeletal. I've talked about this before. He'd be skeletal. He'd be in a fetal position. He'd be right on the edge of death. Most people believe Satan attacked Jesus that whole 40 days, not just the three we have. The three is like either a summary of them or maybe the other three big ones that he hits him with at the end. But for 40 days. Now, not to get funky, but I'm sure demons attack us. Paul says that, Ephesians 6. Our battles are not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and the powers and yada, yada. I don't think any of us have been attacked directly by Satan. Imagine 40 days, you're starving, you're literally dying, and Satan's, this is crazy, right? Because people rejected him, he comes to save them, and they're like, crucify him. He faced persecution and threats. I mean, the whole time, we only have a very small summary of Jesus' life in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? So how many times were those Jewish leaders scheming and trying to kill him and wanting to stone him? And it's just crazy. Judas, friend, 3 years hanging out with him, and then he stabs Jesus in the back, unjustly arrested and tried. The spiritual and emotional agony in the garden just always blows my mind. This is Jesus, who is God. He gets what's going to happen on the cross. He is going to become sin, right? And he is pleading with God. He's pleading with God. I do not want this. I don't want this. But your will be done, right? So again, my whole question is why? Why does all this have to happen? None of that brings our salvation, right? None of it. So what is God doing? Why did Jesus have to live such a horrible, horrible life through all this? And then here's the next slide's all around the crucifixion, right? Scourged with whips, crown of thorns, crucified, which is one of, if not the most painful and degrading forms of execution, becoming the sin of us. Abandonment on the cross, death, crucifixion's just heinous. I mean, you guys know all these, eh? I think in that list, the worst one has to be the becoming our sin, right? I keep talking to people who are like, it must have been so horrible for Jesus in the garden to be so fearful of the crucifixion. I'm like, he doesn't care less about the crucifixion. I mean, that would have been terrifying, but he's not worried about being crucified. He's worried about becoming sin, right? He's worried about taking on your sin, my sin, you podcast people's sin, you video people's sin. That's what he's freaking out about. That's why he's sweating drops of blood, and that's why he's pleading with God, no, there must be another way. I do not want to be sin. I don't. Pleading with him, and God's like, it's the only way, right? And then he says that, not my will, but yours be done, right? And then the abandon just breaks me every time, right? Jesus is God, and he's part of the Trinity in a way we do not understand. He calls out to God, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you deserted me? Not one of us have ever had that, ever. God will never leave us or forsake us, ever, right? We have no idea what that's like. One, not many of us have become the sin of the world. Anyone, right? No, right? We don't know what it's like to call out to God and he's not there. To call out to God and go, why have you deserted me in my time of need? Why, And then the death is hideous, right? I mean, Jesus gives up his spirit, but still he's experiencing all this, the suffocation, just hideous, right? So again, my whole question is why? What is this about other than the becoming sin, right? The abandonment. What is he doing, right? I mean, it's super obvious, right? But I kind of just keep chewing on it. It's this, right? Jesus truly gets the hardship and struggle of humanity. Jesus truly gets the hardship and the struggle of humanity, right? Yeah, he's God. Yes, he's omniscient, omnipresent, all the omnis. He's awesome. He's powerful. But Jesus wanted to be us. He really wanted to get us. Now, you think about it like this. He could have just beamed down, fully human, right before the cross, got crucified, and then beamed back up, right? And there's a whole thing about his life needing to be righteous and all that. There's another whole aspect. But technically, that's what he could have done. But then he would never understand what it's like to be us, right? When we're going through a hard thing and we call out, we'd always think, does God really get this? But Jesus really gets us. He really does. And the extremity that he goes to, being born in a manger in an illegitimate parent, it's just like, what? And then his whole life, right? He really gets us. I was trying to think about how to illustrate this, and this is a lame illustration, but it's the best I can come up with. I've travelled a little bit, not a lot. I've got friends that when they tell me where they've travelled, I'm green with jealousy, right? If you saw me at the light party, I was a frog. I was totally green, and I was about that green when I talked to friends because I just love to travel. I haven't done a lot, but I've done a little bit. I've been to India a bunch of times, right? But I've visited. I have no idea what it's really like to be an Indian, to live there, right? I've been to Papua New Guinea once, way up in the highlands, absolutely terrifying. I don't know what it's like to be a Papua New Guinean. I love America, and I lived in America, and it's my favourite country in the world, even more than New Zealand, but don't tell anyone that. I love America with all of my love, but I'm not American. I don't know what it's like to be American, right? Jesus didn't just visit. He became one of us, right? He became human and then endured just such a hard, horrible life so that he could really understand us. So a couple of verses that I wanted to chuck up. These are real common verses, but this is where my head went, my heart went, so it's all good. Philippians 2, 6-8 says, it's talking about Jesus, though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave, was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. That instead he gave up his divine privileges. You guys know it doesn't mean he undeified himself. It means that he chose not to use a bunch of his divine attributes. I mean, you can't be human and be omnipresent. It doesn't work. Like last time I checked, most of us are in one place at one time. Mums sometimes feel like they're in 50 places at the same time, but most of us are in one place at one time. He couldn't be omniscient. He couldn't be all-knowing and be human, because we're smart. People like Phil, with his 2 doctorates, super smart. The rest of us, we're not as smart as Phil, but Phil, even Phil, is not all-knowing, right? So to be human, Jesus had to, people talk about laying aside, but it's not that he lays aside, he just chooses not to use a bunch of what makes him divine. And in that line, he took the humble position of a slave. He's born a human being. Born a human being, right? To get us, to understand us, right? He knows what it's like to be cold, to be in pain, to be poor. He knows frustration. He knows fear. He knows what it's like to be unfairly judged and hated. He knows what it's like to be weak, to be angry, to be hurt, to weep. He really does get us. That has to take your head straight to this verse in Hebrews, right? I love this. Hebrews 4, 14-16 says, so then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. This high priest of ours, this verse is crazy. I'm going to talk about this verse in the Greek in a minute, and if you don't know what I'm about to say, I'd put a box of cash on it that you'll go, oh my gosh, Craig, that is a crazy verse. So prepare. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses. What does that really mean? Really, he's God. Does he really get what it's like to be struggling to pay the mortgage or to have a sick friend? Or really? For he faced all the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy. We'll find grace to help us when we need it most. It's that middle verse that I just wanted to sit on for just a couple of minutes here. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses. He faced all the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. The 2 words in there are real interesting. So English is a terrible language. Anyone who speaks multiple languages, normally you ask them, they're like, English is rubbish because it's made up of all these words. It's a stupid language. Greek is very, very specific, and for everything they say, there's so many words they could choose, right? So for love, there's 6 words you can choose for love. It's like, what? In English, we just go, love. It's like, well, what does that even mean? Do you love pizza? Do you love your wife? Do you love the All Blacks? I don't know. It's very vaporous, but in Greek, it's very, very specific. And so the 2 words, understands and weaknesses, so I nerded out this week and had a look into them, and this is what it means, right? Understands literally means to suffer alongside, which is crazy, right? To suffer alongside. And then weakness is a real comprehensive, it's a real all-encompassing word that can mean any form of felt need. So now let me read that verse again, putting this meaning in behind it. And literally you can read it like this. Jesus suffers alongside you in whatever felt need you have because he gets you, because he's been there. Does it make sense, eh? Doesn't that make you go, oh my gosh? No? Well, it did to me. You guys are fired. I'm going to read it again. Jesus suffers alongside you in whatever felt need you have because he gets you, because he's been there. No matter what weakness, no matter what struggle, no matter what you're going through, Jesus suffers alongside you. He doesn't play the God card and sit in heaven with a pile of angels bringing him grapes while he's lying on a couch going, oh yeah, sweet as. Not at all, right? He suffers alongside you. Why did the author choose that word? There's so many words he could have chosen for weakness, but instead it's like we have to understand Jesus endured this horrible life to the extreme so that no matter what we come to him with, he goes, I get it. I totally get it. Man, it amazes me, eh? Here's that verse again. I just wanted to bounce on that last bit. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy. We'll find grace to help us when we need it most. I don't know about you, but I'm really arrogant. Yeah, if you're not sure about that, ask Jose. I'm incredibly stubborn. And there are so many times in my life where I think, well, I know I miss out on God's blessing or his guidance or his mercy or his grace because I didn't do the last bit. I didn't go boldly to the throne of our gracious God. And I was like, nah, I'm all good. Hang on, I better work through this first, and then I might go and pray about it, right? Instead, I love how he says it. It's like he understands it, he gets it. So just go and pray, right? Go and pray. I know I've acted this out a million times, and I'm going to pick on Braden. This is like a 30-second thing. It's all good. Just stand there. So pretend Braden's Braden. Pretend I'm God. This is how I always see it. Is that hard to pretend I'm God? Wow. I have a tattoo that declares I'm as righteous as God himself. So you're all fired. Oh, good. So this is how this is kind of weird, but I always imagine it exactly like this. Braden's going through a really hard time, and I always imagine God as just being awesome and able to do anything and just being like, I'm ready, I'm ready to help, man. I can literally help. Anything you need, I'm God. Anything. And then if Braden was me, Braden would be like, hey, I better just try this and we'll sort. And God's like, anytime, bro. Creator of the universe. You know what I mean? Sorry, that's like a weird habit. You know what I mean? No way. I just wonder to be rude, I wonder in your week, your year. It's been weird. So my job, I'm talking to youth and young adults all over the country. It's so funny talking to like a 15-year-old who's like, man, it's been such a rough year. I'm like, shut up. You got no idea what you're talking about. Heaps of the youth, and no offence to our amazing young adults, it's been a rough, hard year. I wonder how many of us this year have gone through things that God was like, oh, I never intended you to go through that. That was not the plan. The plan was for you to hit this wall or hit this thing and call out to me, and I was going to bless you and save you, but you didn't do the last verse, right? You didn't boldly come. All right, you guys know what I'm talking about. All right, quick discussion. Grab a friend, and there's a couple of questions up there you can do. So explain the benefits of being in a relationship with a God who gets you, as opposed to a God, little g, who doesn't. Another question you might want to do, which aspect of Jesus' hard life do you most connect with and appreciate why? So we've just got like a minute or I'm going to get in huge trouble. So grab a friend, have a little kōrero, and then we'll boogie on. Sweet. Okay, kia ora. Kia ora. So let me be good to discuss, because I think those are some good things to wrestle with, but time, So back to this one here. Jesus truly gets the hardship and struggle of humanity, right? He really does get it. I'm going to lead us into communion